What is Aetherflux? Explain it to us.
Yeah. So I started the company with a concept of building a power grid in space. So what does this mean? The idea here is that low Earth orbit is this unique environment for building consumer or electronics applications because you can fly one of the cheapest forms of power production, solar, and also the environment is one where oftentimes consumer grade electronics work. So you can actually operate relatively low cost devices in this environment. And the idea here is that this is one of the new untapped sources of power for humanity. We started out with this mission to actually beam power down to the ground for military bases or places where there's no existing power grid. And we're now spending the majority of our focus on using this concept for powering orbital data centers, which, as we've all witnessed, there's a lot of talk about recently.
Okay, so this is a slight pivot then, because I think the way you described this a year ago was using the satellites to bring the power back to Earth. Now the focus of the company is basically not on Earth at all. It's very much the orbital data centers that Elon is talking about. You're trying to power those with these solar satellites in space.
Yeah, so the concept is actually to build orbital AI data center satellites. So this exact concept where you take the chips and you put them directly on the satellites in space.
Okay,
And yeah,
so you are now firmly in this arena of building the data centers in space.
correct, correct.
Okay. Walk me through that pivot that feels like a bit of a pivot from what the company initially set out at. What was the process like getting there?
Yeah, so we joke around internally that it was a pivot, but we never lifted our pivot foot. So for the basketball analogy, uh,
So you're
well,
not traveling.
no travels. It was we've never
Okay.
lifted our pivot foot. The thought process is actually very closely related between where we started and where the majority of the company's efforts are. Whereas the original concept, we were trying to beam power down to places where there's no existing power grid. The sort of like the basic concept or the rationale for switching to orbital data centers is if you can actually use the power directly in orbit where you're generating it, you don't have to incur the transmission losses because transmitting power from space to Earth, you'll lose a significant amount of the power on the journey, and it's useful in places where there's really no alternative. But for applications like AI, you need as much power as you can get, and based on everything that we've been working on, the space environment is actually one that's uniquely well suited for this application. And we can talk about that a lot more.
So where are you at in your development now, technically speaking?
Yeah, so we have two missions that are going to space this year. The first one is going to be demonstrating the power beaming application. Our team is actively working on doing things like internally testing GPU performance in space environments, so simulating that on Earth, simulating all the challenges with what it's going to look like in space, and sort of going down the path of designing what that future system looks like. So we'll have a lot more to share on this, but we're targeting sometime in the first half of 27 to have GPUs in orbit that will be the building blocks for building a much broader deployment of this technology.
And what is your timeline then? What do you think is the timeline for getting, let alone any compute? You just said, getting GPUs in space. So that is any compute whatsoever. But then there is the question about how much compute there is to actually make a dent in the
Correct.
data center shortage on Earth. I mean, what is the timeline for that in your mind?
I think we'll start to see this be a more significant sort of application of space in the next 5 years. Hopefully a little bit sooner, but I think that's roughly the range that I have in my mind. And I think that's
So
actually
so so 5 years from now, we there will be enough compute in space to make a dent in the demands on Earth.
I think it'll start being useful for meaningful compute applications within the next 5 years. Yeah. I think the overall pie is going to grow excuse me, so substantially in that time. But we actually think that, within the next 5 to 10 years or so, ideally a little bit sooner, the advantages of doing this in space, I would say from our perspective, one of the big advantages are once you get the technology up and running and you sort of work through all the technical challenges and making it do what it's supposed to, the advantage is going to be in actually the ability to bring new compute online much more rapidly versus the terrestrial option. So the process by which the chips are manufactured is industrial manufacturing. And on the ground, the process by which they're brought online is much more driven by real estate and permitting timelines. The dream of this idea is that you can actually take the process of powering the chips and largely turn that into an industrial manufacturing problem. So,
So
going
so
from yeah.
rephrase that for, because I think I'm half catching your drift here. Is that the point you're saying is that you wouldn't have to go through the burden of getting real estate and building physical data centers. Instead, you have the infrastructure in space, and so it's easier to get it online. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, actually, what I'm saying is that once you have the chips, you have two different sort of paths to go down. The terrestrial option involves building the data center, oftentimes building the power plant, working with local communities, getting provisions for power, permitting, etc. Which, as we look at today, in many cases, that's 5 years. Whereas the space option is going to be you take the chips, you integrate them into satellites, move them to the launch pad, and when they're in orbit, they'll be operational within a very short amount of time, within a matter of hours. And so that time from when you've got the chips to when they're useful, we think we can eventually shave that down to a matter of weeks, as opposed to each new chipset having to wait, potentially years to be brought online.
If you can do the upfront work of getting them to space and making that technology work in the
Exactly.
outset. Got it.
Exactly.
How big is the team right now?
So we're growing. We're about 30, 35 people and growing pretty quickly. We're going to need a lot more folks to do this. So if anyone's listening to this that wants to work on space data centers, drop us an email. We're looking.
Are you fundraising?
No comments on that right now.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
I was reading up on some of the earlier days of Robinhood when you and Vlad started the company, and I was reading about your interest in design and qualitative research and user research when you were building this app for customers. And we can have a whole separate conversation about how you decided to not pivot, but expand from stock trading and crypto trading to space data centers. But I wonder where qualitative research and user research comes into play here as you think about orbital space data centers, which is something that, it's not something that I think about. It's not something I thought I needed as a user. Where does that come into play?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and kind of an interesting point. How does that skill set translate? Um, well, one of the things that, regardless of whether you're building a consumer business, an enterprise business, or space business, you have to understand what your customers want and what they care about, and that's the skill set that I think is quite transferable. And one of the things that we've been doing with Aetherflux is spending a lot of time with the folks that are buying compute and really trying to understand what are the things that drive adoption, what are the things that matter, what are the value propositions, if you think about it, that would make space-based data centers a relevant option versus the terrestrial one. I think that's one category. The other category is sort of how do you bring to life a business model that, at first glance looks very challenging, or, you know, there's not a lot of proof points for how it's going to work, because you know a decade plus ago, that challenge that I was working on was how do you make um, things like zero commission stock trading a viable business, where today it's how do you make this orbital data center business viable when you've got the terrestrial options. And I think from my personal point of view, in both cases, it's a challenge of how do you make something economically viable, where there's a lot of indications that it's going to be really challenging, and sort of cracking the code of like, how do you actually make this, like, what's the path to making this work at scale?
And as you've been talking to those customers buying compute and doing all that research, what has surprised you in your findings?
What surprised me, I'd say one of the biggest ones is the way that people talk about this across the board is that it's a race. It's a race to get to the most compute. It's a race to get the capabilities online quickly. And I think that's kind of a statement about the way that the broader tech industry sees AI and bringing it online. And I don't think I've really heard that sort of language of like it's a race, it's a competition as much in previous eras of technology. So that's one thing that's definitely stuck out to me. Uh,
Why do you think that is?
so
Why do you think people talk about it as a race?
That's a really good question. I think that there's a variety of factors. One that comes top of mind to me is that this is one where there's an interest from nation states, right? So the United States is trying to lead with artificial intelligence. We also have, the Chinese that are trying to lead with artificial intelligence. And so I think those kinds of dynamics play into it. Um, Whereas I'm not sure that people thought about, the nation states, you know, going toe to toe for dominance in past internet technologies necessarily.
It strikes me it's a very different environment from the environment that you may have been in 10 years ago whenever you started Robinhood. I mean, it seems like we're very different in terms of how we think about technology and this race idea.
Yeah, it definitely is. Whereas, that last generation was all about like sort of consumer applications, like how do you find things like product market fit and figure out how, that whole wave was driven by mobile, at least from my perspective, right? That was kind of like the major emerging technology that gave sort of a platform for all kinds of different applications across the economy to bloom from, you know, file sharing and photo sharing to online brokerage to, everything in between. Whereas this time there's a sense of winners and losers in many cases, and that's driven by the capabilities of the technology. Like the more advanced models can do things that when you compare it to even things that we saw 2 years ago, you're like, is this even the same technology? It's so much more profound. Um, and I think those dynamics were a little different last time.
Now, on the flip side, the last question I have for you is we talked about the qualitative research and the user research that you're doing. Walk me through the numbers on this opportunity, the economics of when you're pitching to investors. What is the size of the opportunity? How big do you think this company can get? I mean, how do you even think about building this business eventually profitably, and the economics of how much it would cost to create the compute, transmit the compute, charge for compute?
Yeah. So yeah, all of these things, there's a lot of sort of modeling that goes into the economics, really understanding what is the rock bottom cost for each one of the components, and kind of asking the question like, how much does it cost to do each component by component, whether it's, you know the sort of like radiators that dissipate the heat out into space, or the solar rays, etc. Like, what does it cost on a material basis? What is the manufacturing process? And what does that sort of like fully integrated cost result in? Then how do you sort of stitch together all the different components to which you have to go from basically raw materials to manufactured to end products, integrate them, and then ask the question like, how can you configure these technologies? How can you make component level selections that give you access to the economics that are going to make this competitive? And so in many ways, it's kind of like putting together like an economic jigsaw puzzle, because you really have to understand what each one of the pieces that drives this capability, how they work from first principles, and
Hmm.
develop an understanding of like, okay, so we need this much power, per compute node, for example, right? What does that cost? How do you make it? What are the processes that go into making it, as an example?
But
Um,
just to bring it back to a conversation I was having at the start of this show with an investor in public markets, I was asking her the question around how you decide on a valuation for quote unquote moonshot companies, companies that are working on technology that is not going to commercialize for decades in some cases. I know in your case, you said 5 years away, but I mean, when you are out there talking to investors, how do you land on a number? I don't know what the number is unless you want to tell us what the valuation is for the company, but like, whether it's 200 million, 800 million, 1.5 billion, a trillion, how do you land on a number at all?
Well, I'm not on that side of the table. I'm the entrepreneur side, so that's more on the venture capital side. I think it is interesting in this era of technology because in many ways it's tied to the capital that's required to build these capabilities out and what the sort of long term prospects of it look like. So I bring that up because the capital required to bring any meaningful space technology online is gargantuan. It just is. And one of the things that, again, kind of commenting on the space aspect of this, um, that I find really interesting is that this is a very idiosyncratic opportunity in the space world because the capex, for the first time, I would say, for any technology relative to space, the capex of AI versus the capex of space actually makes the capital expenditures for the space component, um, you know, in many cases look actually smaller than the capex that's required for the artificial intelligence side. And so, whereas I think it's been difficult just from the sheer capital requirement to build a lot of space companies, that we kind of live in a time where it's not the most sort of, initial capital intensive things that people are funding. Um, and I think that actually creates an opportunity, especially what we're trying to do is say, how can we leverage space to solve a problem for artificial intelligence, which kind of translates to, you know, how does the capital that's being, deployed today over the last couple of years into AI, how can that translate to actually maturing space technologies in service of that? And these commercial opportunities in space where you have the ability to compete terrestrially on a cost basis, from my 2 years of working in this industry, these are few and far between. And I think from that perspective, space-based data centers, AI in space is like, I think, a very, very idiosyncratic opportunity. The last time we saw something that was commercially viable versus the terrestrial options from space, I'd make the argument that was satellite internet a la Starlink. Um, but again, it's been a little while since that. And the emergence of these new sort of large scale commercial opportunities in space that can be cost competitive with on the ground, like that's I think a really interesting part of this.
Great. Well, Baiju, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Baiju Bhatt, the CEO and founder of Aetherflux here on TITV.